How sniper positions shut down. Enemy observation networks in World War II. Rotero completo. 20 minutos. 3,300 palavras. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What if I told you that during World War II, entire battles were decided without massive offensives, without tanks advancing, and sometimes without the enemy ever understanding why everything suddenly stopped working? And what if I told you that some of the most devastating tactical victories in the war were achieved not by destroying the enemy, but by making them operate completely blind in a conflict where every military manual emphasized firepower and maneuver? A handful of hidden marksmen discovered they could paralyze entire divisions simply by removing the enemy's ability to see if you enjoy deep World War II. History explained beyond the surface level. Subscribe now because this channel is dedicated to uncovering the invisible mechanics of the Second World War. The kind of warfare most documentaries never explain, the tactics that won battles without anyone realizing a battle had even been fought. When most people think about World War II, they imagine overwhelming firepower, massive artillery barrages, armored divisions rolling forward, and air raids flattening cities. But none of those forces meant anything without one fragile element: observation. Every army in World War II depended on eyes on the battlefield. Forward observers, spotters, runners, radio operators, men positioned in church towers, factory ruins, tree lines, hills, and trenches. Artillery could not fire accurately without coordinates. Commanders could not move units without reports, and supply convoys could not advance without confirmation that routes were clear. The entire war machine depended on a network of observation that most commanders assumed would always be there. But on both the European and Pacific fronts, snipers quietly discovered that if you removed the eyes of the enemy, you did not need to defeat their army. You only needed to blind it. Early in the war, snipers were often misunderstood. Many officers viewed them as individual marksmen whose primary role was to harass the enemy, lower morale, or eliminate exposed soldiers. But as the war progressed, snipers evolved into something far more dangerous. They became system disruptors instead of hunting random targets. Snipers observed behavior, they watched patterns. They noted which soldiers raised binoculars after artillery fire, which men consistently moved between command posts, which figures appeared repeatedly at observation points. They learned that wars were not controlled by the men pulling triggers, but by the men gathering information. Once those men disappeared, everything else began to unravel. A forward observer who failed to report back meant artillery units hesitated. A messenger who never arrived meant orders were delayed or lost entirely. A spotter who stopped signaling meant commanders were suddenly operating in the dark. This did not cause immediate chaos. It caused hesitation, and hesitation during World War II was often fatal. Entire sectors of the battlefield froze, not because the enemy was advancing, but because no one could confirm what was happening anymore. Snipers exploited terrain with extreme discipline. They did not choose positions randomly. They selected locations that overlooked predictable observation points, crossroads, ridgelines, supply routes, trench intersections, and ruined structures that naturally attracted observers. Once a position became dangerous to observe, the enemy faced an impossible choice: remain blind or risk. More casualties hunting snipers rarely solved the problem. Patrols sent to locate them often exposed additional observers. Counter-sniper teams struggled because snipers constantly relocated, rotated positions, and coordinated with infantry units. The harder armies tried to restore observation, the more dangerous it became to simply look at the battlefield. If this aspect of World War II warfare is something you have never heard explained this way, like this video now because it helps ensure these overlooked stories continue to be told. As the war continued, commanders on all sides slowly realized a harsh truth. Snipers were not winning battles by body count. They were winning by denying certainty without reliable observation. Artillery fire slowed, air support was delayed, assaults were postponed, and supply movements stalled. Even superior forces lost momentum, not because they were defeated, but because they could no longer see. This is why some of the most heavily defended positions in World War II collapsed not under direct assault, but under isolation and blindness. When observation networks failed, coordination failed. With them, communication became a liability. Command posts went silent, and units began operating independently. Snipers were not lone wolves acting in isolation. They were part of a broader system designed to fracture the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. And this system worked precisely because it was subtle, silent, and difficult to counter. The most powerful effect of sniper pressure was psychological commanders began to distrust their own reports, question their own intelligence, and delay decisions at critical moments and in war. Delay can be more destructive than defeat. At this point in the war, snipers had transformed from individual shooters into instruments of battlefield control, and the enemy often never realized what had happened until it was too late. Now, let me show you exactly how this worked in actual combat and why it became one of the most feared tactics of the entire war. The Soviet Red Army understood this principle earlier than most other forces during the defense of Stalingrad. In 1942, Soviet snipers were not simply positioned to kill German soldiers. They were strategically placed to eliminate German forward observers who directed artillery and mortar fire against Soviet positions. German units advancing through the ruined city depended entirely on spotters, positioned in upper floors of buildings, factory smokestacks, and church towers to coordinate suppressive fire. Once Soviet snipers began systematically targeting these observers, German artillery effectiveness dropped dramatically, not because the guns stopped firing, but because they no longer knew where to aim. One documented Soviet sniper named Vasily Zaitsev specifically recorded that his unit prioritized officers and observers over regular infantry because removing one observer created confusion across entire companies. German attempts to restore observation by sending replacement spotters into known positions resulted in additional casualties, creating a cycle where observation points became death traps. German commanders eventually abandoned certain forward observation posts entirely, which meant entire sections of Stalingrad became unobservable, forcing German units to advance without accurate fire support. This was not about morale or intimidation. This was about operational paralysis. The British Army applied similar tactics during the Italian campaign, particularly around Monte Cassino. In 1944, German forces held elevated positions with near-perfect observation over Allied approach routes, making any daylight movement suicidal. British and Commonwealth sniper teams were deployed not to assault German positions, but to deny them the ability to observe Allied movements. British snipers identified German observation posts by studying patterns of artillery fire whenever Allied units moved and artillery responded. British snipers backtracked the sequence to locate the observers, directing those fires. Once identified, these positions were engaged, repeatedly forcing German observers to either relocate frequently or operate from less effective positions. The result was measurable. Allied units reported reduced artillery accuracy during movements and successful repositioning of forces that would have been impossible under constant observation. German after-action reports from Monte Cassino complained about the inability to maintain reliable forward observation, describing how key observation points became untenable due to persistent sniper pressure. This forced German artillery to rely on pre-planned defensive fires rather than responsive targeting, which gave Allied forces critical windows to maneuver. In the Pacific theater, American forces faced a different challenge. Japanese defenders on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa used concealed observation posts to direct mortar and artillery fire with devastating precision. Japanese spotters were often positioned in caves' hillside bunkers and camouflage positions that were nearly impossible to detect. From a distance, American sniper doctrine evolved specifically to counter this threat. Marine Corps sniper teams were tasked with locating and eliminating Japanese observers before major assaults began. This required patience and pattern recognition. American snipers would observe Japanese positions for hours, waiting for any sign of observation activity, binoculars being raised, signal flags, movements toward known communication points. Once an observer was identified, elimination was immediate and coordinated with infantry advances. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was significant, because losing observation meant losing the ability to effectively employ their primary defensive advantage, pre-sighted artillery and mortar positions. American after-action reports documented how sniper-led observation denial resulted in Japanese artillery firing blindly at predicted approach routes rather than actual troop movements, reducing casualties during critical assault phases. German sniper doctrine during the defense of Normandy in 1944 also prioritized observation disruption. German snipers embedded within hedgerow positions, specifically targeted Allied forward observers, who were essential for coordinating naval gunfire support and artillery strikes against German defensive positions. Allied commanders quickly learned that certain sectors of the Normandy bocage were nearly impossible to observe, safely forcing reliance on aerial reconnaissance and delayed fire missions, which reduced responsiveness during rapidly changing infantry engagements. One American unit reported that during a single week in June 1944, they lost 4 forward observers to German sniper fire, resulting in a documented reduction in artillery support requests. Because remaining observers became hesitant to expose themselves, this hesitation directly impacted the speed of Allied advances in that sector, because without forward observers calling in fire missions, infantry units had to rely on direct assaults against fortified positions, rather than coordinated fire and maneuver. The Eastern Front provided the most extreme examples of observation. Network disruption during Operation Bagration in summer 1944. Soviet forces employed sniper teams as part of their Maskirovka deception operations. Soviet snipers were tasked with eliminating German observation posts along predicted breakthrough sectors days before the actual offensive began. This created blind spots in German intelligence gathering that Soviet forces exploited during the main assault. German commanders reported confusion about the size and location of Soviet buildup because their forward observation network had been systematically degraded in the days leading up to the attack. By the time German high command recognized the scale of the Soviet offensive, their ability to coordinate defensive fires and repositioning was severely compromised, because the observers who would normally provide that real-time intelligence were no longer operational. This was not accidental. This was deliberate operational planning that treated snipers as intelligence denial assets rather than simply as shooters. If you are starting to understand how deeply snipers influenced the operational tempo of World War II beyond just eliminating individual soldiers, make sure you are subscribed, because we are going to continue exploring these hidden battlefield dynamics that shaped the entire war. Now here is where the tactics became even more sophisticated. As the war progressed, snipers did not just eliminate observers, they also manipulated enemy behavior to create predictable patterns that could be exploited. Experienced sniper teams would deliberately allow certain observers to survive while eliminating others, creating uncertainty about which positions were safe. This forced enemy forces to constantly rotate. Observers waste time on counter-sniper operations and divert resources away from offensive operations. Soviet sniper schools specifically taught this technique as part of their doctrine, instructing students to create psychological pressure by making observation itself a high-risk activity that degraded over time, rather than simply eliminating all observers immediately, which would prompt immediate tactical adjustments. The long-term impact of observation denial extended beyond individual engagements. When observation networks were compromised, commanders lost the ability to assess battlefield conditions accurately. This led to flawed intelligence, delayed decision-making, and ultimately strategic errors during the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, German forces initially achieved surprise partially because poor weather limited Allied aerial observation. But even after weather cleared, Allied ground observation remained disrupted by German sniper and infiltration teams targeting forward positions. This observation gap delayed Allied recognition of the full scale of the German offensive by critical hours, allowing German armored spearheads to penetrate deeper than they otherwise would have. American forces eventually restored observation networks, but the initial blindness created by targeted elimination of forward observers contributed directly to the temporary success of the German attack. The effectiveness of observation denial was so significant that by late war period, all major combatants had incorporated counter-observer tactics into standard sniper training manuals. The U.S. Army published field manuals specifically addressing the threat of enemy snipers, targeting forward observers, recommending tactics such as using decoy observers, rotating observation posts frequently, and employing dedicated security teams to protect critical observation positions. The fact that these countermeasures became necessary demonstrates how seriously observation disruption was taken at the highest levels of military planning. This was not a minor tactical consideration. This was a recognized operational threat that required systematic defensive measures. One rarely discussed aspect of this warfare was how observation denial affected artillery effectiveness throughout World War II. Artillery remained the primary cause of casualties, accounting for more deaths than small arms or armored vehicles, but artillery was only effective when properly directed. Forward observers were the critical link between artillery batteries and enemy targets. Without accurate observation, artillery became far less lethal firing at suspected positions rather than confirmed targets. Documented examples from the Hurtgen Forest battles in late 1944 show American artillery units firing massive preparatory barrages that failed to suppress German positions because American forward observers had been eliminated or suppressed by German defensive measures preventing accurate target identification. The result was wasted ammunition, failed assaults, and unnecessary casualties, all because the observation network had been compromised. Soviet doctrine took this understanding further by integrating sniper operations directly into artillery planning. Soviet combined arms tactics assumed that enemy observation would be contested and planned accordingly. Soviet snipers were assigned specific observation posts to neutralize before artillery preparation began, ensuring that when Soviet guns opened fire, German observers would be unable to accurately direct counter-battery fire or adjust defensive fires. This integration of sniper operations into broader fire support planning represented a sophisticated understanding of how observation networks functioned and how their disruption multiplied the effectiveness of other combat systems. This was not snipers operating independently. This was snipers functioning as essential components of combined arms warfare. The psychological toll on soldiers tasked with observation duties became severe as the war progressed forward. Observers and spotters had some of the highest casualty rates of any specialized role in World War II because they were priority targets for enemy snipers. Many soldiers assigned to observation roles developed extreme caution bordering on paralysis, knowing that using binoculars, raising their head above cover, or moving to better observation points could result in immediate death. This fear directly degraded the quality of battlefield intelligence. Even when observers survived, they often provided incomplete or delayed reports because self-preservation instincts conflicted with mission requirements. This created a feedback loop where fear reduced observation and effectiveness, which increased demand for observation, which increased pressure on observers, which increased fear. German military psychologists documented this phenomenon in reports from the Eastern Front, noting that forward observer units experienced disproportionately high rates of combat fatigue and stress casualties compared to other infantry roles. The impact on command decision-making was equally profound. Commanders who could not trust their observation networks were forced to operate with incomplete information, leading to conservative decision-making and missed opportunities during the Ardennes offensive. American commanders initially dismissed early reports of German armor movements, partially because observation networks in that sector had been degraded and intelligence was considered unreliable. This hesitation allowed German forces additional time to exploit their initial breakthrough. Conversely, commanders who over-relied on degraded observation networks sometimes made catastrophic decisions based on faulty intelligence during the Soviet Winter Offensive of 1942. 43 German commanders repeatedly misjudged Soviet force concentrations because their observation networks had been systematically dismantled, leading to defensive deployments that were inadequate for the actual threat they faced. As the war reached its final stages, observation denial tactics had become so widespread that military theorists began recognizing them as a distinct form of warfare. Some post-war analysis compared the systematic elimination of observation networks to strategic bombing campaigns. Both aimed to degrade enemy capabilities by destroying critical infrastructure rather than engaging forces directly. Just as strategic bombing targeted factories and transportation nodes, observation denial targeted the human intelligence network that enabled military operations to function. The difference was that observation denial required far fewer resources, produced immediate tactical effects, and was nearly impossible to defend against comprehensively because it exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in how armies gathered and processed battlefield information. Now, as we reach the end of this examination, consider how different World War II looks. when you understand that many battles were not won by superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but by the simple, brutal effectiveness of making the enemy fight blind. The snipers who executed these missions were not glory-seeking individuals. They were disciplined professionals, executing a mission that most soldiers never fully understood. They spent hours motionless observing patterns, waiting for the single moment when a target presented itself. And when they fired, it was not to achieve a high body count. It was to remove one critical node from an observation network, knowing that the effects would ripple outward, degrading enemy capabilities far beyond the single casualty they inflicted. This was warfare at its most calculated and its most effective, because it attacked the one thing every military force assumed would always be available: the ability to see the battlefield, and the moment that assumption proved false, everything else began to collapse. If this exploration of World War II's hidden tactical dynamics resonated with you, subscribe now, because this channel exists to uncover exactly these kinds of stories. The ones that explain how wars were truly fought beyond the dramatic narratives most documentaries present. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.